والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. Beloved brothers and sisters, honorable ulama, huffaz, hujjaj, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, in our fiqh this evening, we are in Kitab al-Tahara and we are looking at those things or those actions which are forbidden when you are in a state of minor impurity. Not major impurity, but minor impurity. What are you not allowed to do, inshallah? So essentially, when you are in a state of minor impurity, you require the wudu to engage in these actions. So the Shaykh writes that the following four things are forbidden when you are in a state of minor impurity. In other words, you are in need of wudu. That these things, haruma alayhi arba'at ashya, that the following four things are haram upon the individual who does not have wudu. The first one, which we would know, as-salah. That salah, you need your wudu to perform the salah. Secondly, at-tawaf. That to perform any of the types of tawaf, tawaf of your umrah, tawaf of ifadah, tawaf that is sunnah, and tawaf of wida'. Those are your types of tawaf. You need to be in a state of wudu. For those who did the fiqh of umrah and hajj, you know that you don't need to be in a state of wudu, or you don't need wudu for the performance of your salah. But that's in the fiqh of umrah and hajj. And then the Shaykh writes, and the following two, the final two, relate to the Quran. This is a very important section, so that let us not make a mistake here, inshallah. The Shaykh writes, وَمَسُّ الْمُصْحَفِ وَحَمْلُهُ, that you need to be in a state of wudu for the following two things related to the mushaf. Now, if we often use the word Quran, and when the Quran is in a published or a book form, we refer to it as a mushaf. So commonly we say the Quran, you're touching the Quran, but technically when the Quran is in a printed form, it is a mushaf. So the Shaykh writes, وَمَسُّ الْمُصْحَفِ, the touching of the Quran, the book. And the last one, وَحَمْلُهُ, and the carrying of it. And that's what I want to touch on. I think we understand that you cannot perform salah without wudu, and we understand that you cannot perform tawaf without wudu. If you are in a state of minor impurity, those two actions may not be performed. The final two relate to the Quran. So let's understand, and the ulama, the fuqaha, have written extensively about the Quran. And it's important that we afford the Quran the appropriate respect. So there are common mistakes made because we don't understand this area. So let us clarify that, inshallah. It's not permissible to touch the Quran across all schools of thought. The actual mushaf, the book, the Quran, we can't touch it in all madhahib without the state of wudu. Right? And the ulama, they then take it a little bit further, and they say, and now I'm going to go into the Shafi'i madhab in particular, you may not touch the spaces in between lines, the margins, the binding, the carrying strap, nor a box that within which the Quran is contained without the state of wudu. You're not allowed to touch it in all of those ways. And it's quite beautiful to see how the ulama write, not even the spaces on the pages. And I will draw on this shortly. So they summarize it, and they say that the area where the writing is especially should not be touched in the Quran. Then let's talk about the cover of the Quran. So some ulama have posed the question, Well, what about the cover of the Quran? Because that does not contain the verses. So the ulama have written, anything attached to the Quran via stitching or glue is part of the Quran. So this is an important criterion. Whatever is attached to it through stitching or glue, or was attached to it. So if a Quran is used quite a bit, the cover becomes loose after a while. But that was originally part of that Quran. So it retains its ruling that you can't touch it without the state of wudu. Now we come to the next layer. If the Quran is placed into a sleeve, so we often know when children go to madrasa, maktab, they put the Quran in a sleeve. What is the ruling on touching the sleeve that is over the Quran? And the ulama differ regarding this. Some ulama say that the sleeve is now part of the cover of the Quran, and therefore it may not be touched without wudu. The other ulama say it is not attached to the Quran via stitching or glue. It is a loose sleeve, and therefore it does not take on the ruling of the cover, and so you may touch it without wudu. That is a majority opinion, the second, the latter, that if the Quran is in a sleeve that is not glued onto it. So we must be very careful. Sometimes Qurans or a mushaf is made and there's a material covering. But if that material covering has been glued to the cover, it now takes on the ruling of a cover, meaning wudu would be needed across all schools of thought. If it is a loose sleeve, the Quran was slipped into it, then the opinion that we can take, which is a majority opinion here in our part of the world, is that you won't need wudu to touch it. Now we come to the section on portions of the Quran, right? Portions of the Quran. So you get, for example, a juz of the Quran that is, a Quran that is printed into separate ajza. Each juz is its own booklet. Can you touch the booklet without wudu? The ulama differ. And very importantly, this gets extended to even a surah on its own. So the Surah Yasin Kitab or Surah Mulk, etc., if it contains only that surah or only verses of the Quran, the ulama differentiate between, let's say, an Arwah booklet or Ratib al-Haddad booklet. Because the Ratib al-Haddad and the Arwah, they contain additional adhkar, not only Quranic ayat. And this is an important differentiation because the ulama say, if it is only verses of the Quran, the safer opinion is that you need wudu to touch it, if it is in a printed format. This is what the ulama indicate. Then they say, if, however, it is not exclusively Quran, there is another language, like translation, or there's other verses or adhkar, it no longer has the ruling of Quran. And then you won't need wudu to touch it. Okay. I think there's going to be questions after this session, inshallah. I see the eyes already looking, mashallah. Great, great. Now we go in, so that relates to the portions of the Quran. So it is always respectful. So let's take a Surah Yasin Kitab. A Surah Yasin Kitab that only has Surah Yasin. Nothing else. No translation, no additional adhkar, that is exclusively Quran. The ulama say it must be afforded the respect of Quran completely, and it is then highly preferable that you have wudu to touch it. If you want to touch the Quran and you don't have wudu, we now talk about what is the covering in between, right? So there's a Quran, maybe you are in the masjid, you are reading and your wudu breaks. How do you handle it then? Perhaps you want to move the Quran. So what are the rulings about touching the Quran indirectly, to move it? The ulama write that the covering you use, the ghilaf, the covering that you use must not be clothing that you are wearing. So it can't be your sleeve, it can't be a glove. It must be a loose item that you take to pick up the Quran and move it. So like a cloth, a musalla, and if you, let's say you are wearing a scarf, you can take the scarf off. You mustn't be wearing the item that you use. So it can be a loose item that you then use to move the Quran. Okay? And let's talk about the digital Quran. Oh, mashallah. So much fatwa regarding the digital Quran. So I'm going to go into, because the madhahib also differ regarding the digital Quran. So in the Shafi'i madhab, alhamdulillah, wudu is not needed for the digital, meaning the Quran app on your phone. The Hanafi madhab, the Hanafi scholars have indicated, when verses of the Quran are on your screen and nothing else, wudu is needed. If it's only verses of the Quran on your screen and nothing else. The Hanbali madhab says, when the verses of the Quran are on your screen, you can't touch the verses, but any other part of the screen is possible. So with regards to the digital Quran, general consensus that you can touch the phone, that in the Shafi'i madhab there's no limitation, wudu will not be required. In the Hanafi madhab, if it fills the screen, wudu is required. If not, it's not required. And in the Hanbali madhab, irrespective of it filling the screen or not, you can't physically touch the verses of the Quran. And in the Hanbali madhab, they also extend it and they say, if a verse of the Quran is written anywhere, it may not be touched without wudu. So on a board, on a sign, in the Hanbali madhab is quite strict, you need wudu to touch the verse of the Quran. And an exception they have is that if a child touches it, they excuse. So alhamdulillah, these are the laws relating to affording the Quran its respect, and when you require wudu, and when it is overlooked. And this relates to a minor state of impurity. We will look at in the next fiqh lesson a major state of impurity when you are in need of a ghusl and so forth, inshallah. So as I conclude, wudu is needed for salah and tawaf, and wudu is needed to touch the Quran directly. Questions, inshallah? Lots of questions, inshallah. Any questions? Yes. So so the Haji is asking a question about the Shafi'i's view regarding the digital Quran. But let me also just mention, it is not a requirement to have wudu to recite Quran, right? So you can read Quran from memory and from a sign without having wudu. It's not a requirement to have wudu in a state of minor impurity as well. Yes, so the question is, I'm repeating the question because they're online and the sisters have said that I'm not repeating the questions. So the question is, in the Shafi'i madhab, if it's a digital Quran on your phone, can you touch it? Can you move through pages and read without wudu? Yes, in the Shafi'i madhab. The leeway is granted. The differences of opinion rest in Hanafi and in Hanbali fiqh. The Hanafi, they indicate if it fills your screen, then you need wudu to touch. And in the Hanbali, now, of course, in the Hanafi, you don't necessarily have to touch the verse to change the screen, to move to the next page, to scroll. The Hanbali says it is limited to the actual verses, the tulis, the Arabic writing. Any other questions? Definitely, yes. The question is there a difference in reward when reading with and without? There is more reward when reading with wudu. Yes. Okay, inshallah. So I think we learn to afford the Quran all the respect, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan. Wa sallallahu wa sallam alayhi wa